It is a little after midnight, and the pain wakes you before you know that you're awake. Not a sharp thing at first. A dull, spreading pressure along the right side of your jaw, deep under one of the back teeth. The kind of ache that seems to climb out of a bad dream and then turns out to be real. You lie still in the dark and wait for it to pass. It doesn't pass. It gathers and it begins to beat, slow and steady, in time with your own heart, as though something inside the tooth has a pulse of its own now and wants you to know it. You're in a one-room cottage in England, and the year is somewhere near 1400. The fire has gone down to a low red memory in the hearth. Beyond the shutter, the night is the real night. No street light bleeding under the door, no glow along the horizon, nothing. And the cold has a weight to it, a pail of water by the wall with a lid of ice on top. Your family sleeps an arm's length away in the same bed, and there is no one to send for, and nothing on any shelf in the house, no bottle, no tablet, no drop of anything that will reach into that tooth and switch the pain off. If you were to wake the woman next door and ask her what was happening to you, she would tell you calmly and with complete confidence the thing that everyone knew, that a small worm had crept into the tooth and was eating it from the inside. This is not a rare piece of bad luck. It is one of the most common disasters in the medieval world, so ordinary that it barely troubles the written record, and it is coming sooner or later for very nearly everyone alive tonight. A bad tooth in a world without dentists is not the passing nuisance it is to us. It can take away your ability to eat, to sleep, to work, to hold a single thought that isn't the pain. It can last for days, for weeks. Once in a while, it can kill you. And there is no profession, no building, no trained person anywhere whose whole job is to make it stop. What there is instead is a quiet craft of endurance built up over centuries to outlast the thing happening in your jaw right now. The remedies, the rituals, the prayers, and, at the very end of the road, a pair of iron pliers. It's stranger than you'd guess, and cleverer, and here and there it will catch you off guard by how well it actually worked. These were capable, quick-witted people, facing a harder problem than almost anything we will ever meet, and working at it with everything they had. So tonight we're going to stay in this room and in this pain, and follow it the whole way through, from the first ache in the dark to the last desperate remedy at the fair, and find out what it truly was to carry a toothache through a world that had no way to cure one. It's worth holding on to that as we go, because it's easy to forget how much of being alive for almost everyone who ever lived was simply this, the managing of a pain that had no cure. Most of us keep a small private miracle in a bathroom cabinet and never once think about it. To the people whose nights we're about to share, that little bottle would have looked like something close to magic. Not because they were any simpler than us, but because they hurt routinely in ways we have arranged never to feel, and got up the next morning and went to work anyway. But before we step back into the dark and into that tooth, one small thing. If you find yourself drawn to this kind of thing, these close, unhurried trips inside an ordinary life from another century, consider subscribing, and we'll keep climbing into these forgotten lives together. And if something tonight catches you and won't quite let go, some small detail you'd never once thought about, a corner of the past you didn't see coming, leave it in the comments. Half the pleasure of all this is turning up the parts we'd otherwise have walked straight past. Now, let's go back into that room and that tooth in the last cold hours before the light. The light, when it finally comes, doesn't help. That's the first thing to understand about a bad tooth in this world, and it may be the hardest for us to feel our way back into, because for us, a toothache is a problem with a solution. You make an appointment, someone drills out the rot, packs the hole, sends you home, and within a week, you've half forgotten it happened. The damage is undone, the clock quietly runs backward, and the tooth you nearly lost is a tooth again. in a one-room cottage in 1400, the clock only runs one way. A tooth that has begun to go is going to keep going. You can slow it and soothe it and learn to live around it, but you cannot mend it. Whatever is eating that tooth will go on eating it this week and next month and next year until the tooth is gone. The ache that woke you in the dark isn't really an event the way it would be for us. It's the opening of a debt you'll keep paying in one coin or another for the rest of your life. So the question that shapes the whole ordeal isn't how to cure the tooth. It's who you turn to and how long you can bear to wait before you do. And the answer depends less on what's wrong than on what you can pay. The first help is the nearest to hand, the women of your own household who carry a whole apothecary in memory, a poultice for this and a rinse for that, passed down from a mother who had it from hers. If that fails, there's the wise woman a few doors along or in the next village, who knows the herbs better than anyone and will say a prayer over the pain besides. And past her, when the tooth still won't be talked out of your head, come the people who take it out. The barber who shaves your neighbours by day and does their bleeding and their tooth drawing on the side. The blacksmith who has the grip and the iron to wrench a tooth the way he'd draw a nail. And, on market day, the travelling tooth drawer working the crowd from a raised platform at the fair. Notice who isn't anywhere on that list. The one man for miles with real medical training, the physician with his Latin and his years at a university, will not come near your mouth. The reason isn't skill, it's status. Pulling teeth and cutting flesh is handwork, the trade of barbers and smiths, and a learned man does not do handwork. So the person best schooled to help you is the very one who holds your rotten tooth beneath him, and the ones who actually take it on are the shaver, the smith, and the showman, which tells you something true about this world and easy to miss, that the knowledge to help a person and the willingness to touch them did not always live in the same hands. Whatever you turned to, the hardest step was often the one we still know, the walk towards someone who is about to hurt you. If you have ever sat in a waiting room with your stomach in a knot, listening for your name, dreading a stranger's hands in your mouth, then you already understand a good deal of this life. You felt a thin shadow of it. Now take that dread and set it in a mouth with nothing to numb it, alongside the real chance that the cure will cost you more blood than the disease, and you begin to feel why so many people chose instead to wait. To try one more poultice, to pray, to give the tooth another night and another, in the hope that this flare, like the last one, might quietly pass on its own. It's tempting, picturing the mouths these people were so desperate to protect, to picture something grim, rows of blackened stumps, ruined smiles, the rotten grin we've been taught to hang on the word medieval. Run your tongue along the backs of your own teeth for a moment, the smooth enamel, the clean edges, and hold that against whatever you're imagining in their heads. You'd be wrong. Not by a little either, wrong in a way that turns the whole picture around. Because when you look, actually look, tooth by tooth at the people who really lived in this world, the very first surprise is waiting right there in the bone. Here is what the skeletons say. When archaeologists lift the jaws from a medieval English churchyard and count the cavities, the dark little pits we spend our whole lives brushing to keep away, they find surprisingly few. In some of these old mouths, the rate of decay runs at a fraction of a modern one. You can travel along a whole row of teeth, 600 years dead, without meeting a single hole. The reason is almost embarrassingly plain. They had next to no sugar. Honey was a luxury saved for feast days and the sick, and the cheap white sugar that soaks a modern life. Hidden in the bread, the sauce, the drink you'd never think to call sweet, simply did not exist yet. Decay of the kind that bores those dark pits feeds on sugar above almost anything else. Take it out of the diet and most of the holes go with it. The rot we imagine as the natural fate of an aging tooth turns out to be, in large part, something we did to ourselves much later. once sugar turned cheap. But before you envy them their clear, cavity-free smiles, look again, because those same teeth are ruined in a way that ours almost never are. They are worn flat. The biting surface of a healthy back tooth is a small landscape of peaks and hollows, the cusps a tooth uses to grind its food. On a medieval molar by middle age, those are simply gone, filed down to a smooth, shallow saucer, the way a stone doorstep is scooped out by centuries of feet. And the thing that did the filing was in every loaf they ate. Their bread was ground between two great stones, and stone turning on stone sheds grit, fine, hard, all but invisible flecks of the millstone itself, baked straight into the daily loaf. Every mouthful was faintly gritty, and their teeth paid for it slowly, one meal at a time, across a lifetime. By 18, the enamel on a young person's molars could already be worn clean through to the softer layer beneath. Keep grinding decade after decade, and the wear reaches the living core of the tooth, the nerve, the pulp, and there you have the whole misery of a rotten tooth, the throbbing and the swelling and the sleepless nights in a tooth that never carried a single cavity. You can see the two facts sitting side by side in the ground. At one English burial site, the numbers land almost comically far apart. Barely one tooth in 40 showed a cavity, and yet more than 1 in 10 had abscessed at the root, a mouth thick with infection and hardly a hole to be found. And there is one last thing the bones quietly put right, the ugliest piece of the whole myth, the notion that these were filthy people who never spared their teeth a thought. They thought about them constantly. The English physicians of the day left recipes for tooth powders, pepper and salt and mint, ground fine and rubbed on with a scrap of linen after meals, and they wrote about scrubbing the gums till they bled and rinsing the mouth with herb-steeped wine to leave the breath sweet. One writer marvelled that people could keep their teeth so clean they shone like ivory. The wish for a fresh mouth and a bright smile is not a modern invention. It is one of the oldest vanities we have, and they carried it every bit as hard as we do. None of which means their mouths were comfortable places to live. And that catch matters, because fewer cavities is not at all the same thing as a mouth that didn't hurt. Beside the smooth, worn teeth sat thick ridges of hardened tartar, gums that shrank and bled, teeth that loosened and fell and left gaps that never filled, and, often enough, that deep ache at the root that no cloth or powder on earth could reach. Their teeth troubled them less in the ways ours do, and far more in ways we've nearly forgotten were possible. They weren't a lucky people born with perfect smiles. They suffered on a different map. Which leaves one question hanging over that worn-down mouth, lying awake with an abscess and no cavity to blame. He knows nothing of grit in his bread, or exposed nerves, or the slow arithmetic of a tooth ground through to its core. He knows only that something is in there, deep in the jaw, and that it hurts as though it were alive. So what did he think was happening to him? What was the story his whole world told, from the poorest field hand up to the king's own physician, about the thing that ate a tooth from the inside? Suppose you had never heard the word bacteria. You'd never seen a germ swimming under glass, never been told that your own mouth is home to whole invisible cities of the things. All you have is the tooth, throbbing, gnawing, the pain flaring and fading and creeping along the jaw as though something inside were slowly turning over, hunting for a better place to bite. What would you decide was in there? For most of human history, in almost every corner of the world, people decided the same thing. A worm, and they didn't mean it as a figure of speech. They meant an actual small creature, curled inside the tooth, drinking its blood, and gnawing at the root the way a maggot hollows an apple, or a woodworm tunnels a beam. The idea is staggeringly old. The oldest written trace of it we have was pressed into wet clay in the ancient Near East, well over 2,000 years ago. A little spell that lays out the worm's whole life story, how it was made, how it begged the gods to be allowed to live down in the gums and the teeth, how it settled in to feed. From there it turns up nearly everywhere the record survives, from Egypt to Rome to China to the villages of medieval England, with such stubborn consistency that it outlived the empires and the languages and the gods that first wrote it down. And this is the part worth slowing down over, because it's the piece we're quickest to sneer at and slowest to really understand. The worm was not a stupid idea. It was a genuinely good reading of the only evidence anyone had. Look at a rotten tooth with no microscope and nothing that modern medicine has since told you, and what do you actually see? A dark hole, bored clean into something hard. The very kind of hole a worm leaves in wood, or in a nut, or in a piece of fruit left too long. Then feel the pain. It doesn't sit still the way a bruise does. It moves, it gnaws, it wakes and quiets on a schedule of its own, for all the world like something alive and busy in there. And everyone alive already knew, from meat left out too long and bodies left in the ground, that worms simply appear inside things that rot. Put those three plain observations side by side, and a worm in a decaying tooth stops being superstition and becomes something closer to a reasonable guess. The belief was wrong, the reasoning behind it was as sound as anything they had the tools to manage. It's tempting, too, to file the worm under peasant nonsense, the sort of thing the common folk swallowed while educated men knew better. They didn't. The worm sat at the very centre of learned medicine as well. The physicians in the great universities, the men with their degrees and their Latin, taught that a bad tooth filled up with corrupt, rotting fluids, and that those rotting fluids could breed the worm, exactly as rot was thought to breed worms anywhere else. The field hand and the professor were staring into the same hole in the same tooth and arriving at the same answer. The learned version simply had more theory wrapped around it. So the cure followed the theory, and on its own terms it made perfect sense. If a worm is in there, you smoke it out. You are sitting on a low stool, bent forward over a shallow pan, and a healer scatters a handful of small black seeds onto a hot coal. The seeds are henbane, a common rank-smelling weed that grows on the waste ground at the edge of any village and one of the more poisonous plants in the country. As they catch, they throw off a thick, acrid, faintly sweet smoke, and the healer funnels it through a reed, a twist of paper, sometimes a little tube, straight onto the aching tooth. Your eyes stream and your head swims, and you're told to hold your open mouth over the fumes and breathe, and let the smoke go to work on the thing inside you. The strange part is what that smoke actually did, because it wasn't nothing. Henbane is a narcotic. Breathe enough of it and it dulls sensation and sends a heavy, floating numbness down through the mouth and the head. It belongs, distantly, to the same family of plants we still turn to when we need to deaden a nerve. The theory behind the cure was pure invention. There was no worm, and yet the cure itself, by sheer accident, reached in and quieted the very pain it was invented to explain. And that is precisely how a completely wrong idea can survive, unbroken, for thousands of years. When you actually did it, you felt better. The worm was a fiction that paid its own way. But feeling better wasn't the same as being convinced, and the cleverest part of the whole business was the proof. A good healer, or a good swindler, and the line between them could be very thin, didn't simply announce that the worm was gone. He showed it to you. You would spit into a bowl of water, or he'd hold the water beneath your chin as the smoke cleared, and there, floating on the surface, would be the worms themselves. Small, pale, curved little threads drawn out of your own jaw. Proof, twitching in the dish, that the thing had been real and was now dead. They were seeds. When henbane seeds are heated, they split, and a tiny pale curl of the germ inside works its way out. A little white comma of plant matter that looks, to a frightened person staring into a bowl by firelight, exactly like a small dead worm. The showman on the fairground stage understood this perfectly. Some went further and palmed real worms or short snippets of lute string to drop in at the right moment, and people were not all fools about it. 800 years ago, a writer in Syria set down a whole book exposing the tricks of con men, and the toothworm swindle already had its place in it, described almost exactly as it would still be working 500 years later in England at the fair. It's worth sitting a moment with how real this creature was to them, how vividly it lived behind the eyes. There survives, from the 1700s, a small object carved in France from a single piece of ivory, shaped like a human back tooth and about the size of your thumb. It opens down the middle, like a locket, and inside, worked in miniature, is a scene of hell. Tiny, naked figures twisting in carved flames, and among them the worm itself, a scaled little demon coiled around its victims, gripping and feeding. That is what a toothache felt like from the inside, rendered in ivory. Not an ache, but a small private damnation, a monster that had made its home in your jaw. Against a monster like that, the smoke of a poison weed was only ever the opening move. If the worm would not be driven out, there was a whole deep drawer of other things to reach for, some of them useless, some of them outright fraud, and a few of them once again, quietly and almost by accident, real. You would start with whatever was already in the house and work outward from there, from the cheap and the near to hand toward the rare and the frightening, trying each thing in its turn, because when a tooth is screaming at 2 a.m, doing something is the only bearable option there is. And a few of the things you'd reach for genuinely worked, not by magic and not by luck, but for reasons we've only lately been able to name. Take a clove. The small, dark, dried flower bud, hard and sharp-smelling, carried halfway around the world from the far side of the Indian Ocean and worth, by weight, several days of a labourer's pay. For most people it was far too dear to waste, but those who could lay hands on one learned what it could do. Crush it against the aching tooth, or just bite down on it, and within a minute the gum begins to go numb. That isn't suggestion or hope. The oil inside a clove is a real anesthetic, more or less the same thing a modern dentist still rubs into your gum before the needle goes in. They had no idea why it worked. They only knew, passed from mouth to mouth across generations, that it did. Better still, and this is the one that ought to give you pause, was myrrh, the bitter reddish gum that bleeds from a scrubby desert tree, the same myrrh carried to a manger in the Christmas story and swung in censers in every great church in Europe. Pressed against a bad tooth, myrrh does 2 things at once, and both are real. It numbs, like the clove, but it also reaches deeper, quieting the pain along the very channels our own strongest painkillers use, as if the tree had learned long before we did how to turn the hurt down. By the measure of a modern laboratory, it is one of the most genuinely effective things in the whole medieval medicine chest, and people had been holding it against sore teeth in one form or another for well over 1,000 years. Stranger than either was a root called pellitory. Chew a piece and something faintly alarming happens. The whole mouth comes alive, the saliva pouring far past anything you could summon on purpose, a hot, prickling tingle spreading over the tongue and gums and settling into a mild numbness. For a mouth clenched around a single burning point, that flood and that tingle were a real if modest mercy. The ache blurred, the mouth washed and busy, the mind handed something else to feel, and when the gentle things failed, there was the option nobody wanted and everybody knew: fire. A surgeon, or anyone bold enough to try, would heat a slender iron until the tip glowed, slide it down a little metal tube meant to guard the lips and tongue, and press the red heat straight into the hole in the tooth. The oldest written instructions are almost tender in their caution. Do it several times, they say, and take the greatest care not to burn the gums. It is exactly as horrifying as it sounds, and in its brutal way it worked. because a nerve burned through is a nerve that has stopped sending pain. You destroyed the messenger to silence the message. The learned doctors, for their part, had a statelier way of trying everything. Where the village worked by instinct and inheritance, they worked by theory. The tidy, confident theory that the body was governed by a balance of fluids and that a toothache meant some corrupt fluid had gathered in the head and trickled down to settle in the jaw. So they would bleed you to draw it off, or purge you, or feed you a herb whose cold nature was meant to answer the hot nature of the pain. It was grander than a peasant's clove and far better spoken. It helped about as often, which is to say now and then, and never for the reasons anyone believed. All of which leaves one genuine puzzle, the thing that holds the whole ramshackle cabinet together. Look down that list, the clove that truly numbs, the myrrh that truly damps the pain, the fire that kills the nerve, the bleeding that does nothing, the charm that does less, and you'd expect people, over centuries, to slowly sift the remedies that worked from the ones that didn't. They mostly didn't sift anything. And the reason is that a toothache is a liar. Left alone, the pain of a bad tooth very often ends by itself. The inflamed nerve inside, swollen and choked, simply dies, and a dead nerve sends nothing. So the agony that kept you up for 3 nights just stops, or the infection gathers into an abscess, swelling and building until it bursts, draining its pressure into the mouth in a foul, blessed rush. Either way, the crisis passes on its own schedule, having nothing to do with whatever you last put in your mouth. But you don't know that. All you know is that yesterday you chewed the root, or wore the charm, or let the smith touch you with the iron, and today the pain is gone. So the root gets the credit, the charm gets the credit. The nonsense and the medicine both take the credit side by side, and both are handed to the next generation with precisely the same confidence. It is one of the oldest traps the human mind has, and we have not climbed out of it yet. We simply fall in now with supplements and miracle diets, where they fell in with worms and fire. So you tried everything you could reach, in the order your purse and your nerve allowed, and kept a quiet faith in whichever thing seemed to help. How much of it ever reached a given aching mouth, we honestly can't say. The medicine of ordinary people travelled by voice and died with them, and what survives leans toward the physician's shelf and the rich household's accounts. But the shape is plain enough. You did not simply lie there and endure. You fought with everything the age put within your reach. And when the clove and the root and the iron had all been spent, and the pain still would not break, and the light failed once more beyond the shutter, there was one last place to turn, one that cost nothing and asked only that you believe. In the flat light of a single candle, a woman ties a scrap of parchment to the side of a man's face. It is small, no bigger than a strip torn from the margin of a page, and it is covered in writing. A line or two of Latin, and between the words, drawn in ink, a scattering of little crosses. She folds it once, presses it to his swollen jaw, and binds it there with a strip of cloth wound over the crown of his head, so it rests against the hot skin like a poultice. Then she says the words aloud, softly, the way you'd calm a frightened animal. He cannot read what is written on the parchment. Neither, most likely, can she. It doesn't matter. The power was never thought to live in the reading. What is written there is a prayer, and the name in it belongs to a woman who died more than 1,000 years earlier in the Egyptian city of Alexandria. In the oldest account we have of her, she is old, a deaconess of the early church, caught up in a wave of mob violence against Christians. They seize her, and they strike her in the face until they have broken every tooth in her head, and then they raise a fire and threaten to throw her in unless she gives up her faith, and she steps into the flames herself. Her name was Apollonia, and for the shattering of her teeth she became, across the whole of Christian Europe, the saint you called on when your own teeth turned against you. You will still see her in old church paintings, a calm figure holding up a pair of long iron pincers with a single tooth gripped in their jaws. But that is the artist's tidying, added centuries later to make her easy to recognize. The story itself is older and cruder, not a tooth drawn cleanly, but a face beaten in until the teeth were gone. People in pain did not need her to have suffered neatly. They needed her to have suffered the very thing they were suffering, and to have come out the far side of it a saint, close to God, and well placed to help. The prayer tied to the man's jaw might name her outright. Another, just as common, told a tiny story instead. In it, St. Peter sits by the water holding his face, and Christ comes and asks him what is wrong. "My teeth hurt," Peter says, and Christ heals him and commands the pain to have no power over anyone who carries these words written down. That was the charm, a story you wore, a small piece of scripture pressed to the skin so that the mercy shown to Peter might travel by some thread of holy logic all the way to you. It's easy, from here, to file all of this under witchcraft, something furtive and half-pagan at the shadowed edge of a Christian world. It was nothing of the kind. This was ordinary, respectable devotion. The same church that ran the parish blessed the saying of the Lord's Prayer over a sick body, and a written prayer worn against the skin sat easily inside that. There were lines, and people knew them, a holy name, a scrap of true scripture, the sign of the cross were all perfectly fine. It was the strange, meaningless words, the ones that came from nowhere the church could vouch for, that earned a frown. The scrap tied to that man's jaw was not the wild midnight magic we might picture, a pane hammered into the trunk of an oak. It was closer to the small printed prayer card a frightened relative might still slip into a hospital bed today. And this is the gentlest, most human truth in the whole story. It helped, not in the way we would mean it. The tooth was rotting still, and there had never been any worm for a saint to drive out. But fear sharpens pain. A mind braced and frightened and alone in the dark feels every throb twice over. And prayer met exactly that. It gave you something to do with your hands and your voice when there was nothing else to be done at all. It set a companion at your side through the worst hours. A woman who had felt this same ruin in her own mouth and was now, you believed, listening. It folded a private, senseless agony into a larger story, one where you were watched over, and the pain was survivable. None of that mended the tooth. All of it made the tooth easier to carry. When there is genuinely no cure, the reach for help becomes its own kind of help, and there is nothing foolish in reaching. You can find that reach in the smallest gestures of these lives. A mother bent over a child who has been crying for hours with a swollen face, unable to give him anything that will truly stop it, murmuring the old words against his hair because it is the one thing still left in her power. She is not ignorant. She is doing exactly what any of us would do, and still do, at the ragged edge of what medicine can fix. But the words did not always work, because of course they couldn't. Sometimes the saint stayed silent and the pain only climbed, the face swelling tighter, the fever rising, the nights stretching past all bearing, and a person who had prayed and smoked and soothed and swallowed everything the world had to offer would come, at last, up against the hardest truth in this whole ordeal. Some teeth cannot be talked out of the jaw, or charmed out, or waited out. Some teeth have to be pulled, and that meant facing exactly what every soul in this story had been straining, with every prayer and every remedy, to avoid. Market day, and the square is loud. Somewhere in the press of stalls and livestock and shouting, there is a small raised platform, and on it a man in a coat too bright for an honest trade, a drum going beside him, and laid out on the boards at his feet the teeth of everyone he claims to have cured. This is the tooth drawer. The teeth are his advertisement. Everyone, he'll tell you, pulled clean and painless from a grateful customer. A crowd has gathered, Because a tooth drawing was entertainment in a world with little enough of it, and because every person watching knows that one day it will be them up on the boards. You'll often hear that the drum and the fiddle were there to cover the noise, to drown out the screaming of whoever was in the chair. It's a vivid detail, and it belongs to a different story. A stage act from 3 centuries later, polished up and sold to modern ears. The music at a real fair had a plainer job. It was there to gather a crowd and hold one, the way a barker's shout gathers a crowd today. The screaming needed no cover. It was part of what people had come to see. Strip away the coat and the audience, though, and the showman on the platform was doing precisely what the barber did in his back room and the blacksmith did at his forge. The same act, with less noise around it. Most teeth in most lives came out quietly and without spectators, in a doorway, on a stool by the fire, with a neighbour gripping your shoulders. Loud or quiet, the thing itself never changed. And to feel what the thing itself was, you have to look at the tool. For most of these centuries, the tool was an iron instrument called a pelican, named for a hooked claw at its end that curved like a bird's beak. It did not draw a tooth the way you might picture, straight up and out of the gum. It worked sideways. The claw hooked over the crown of the bad tooth, a small bar braced against the gum or against the teeth to either side, and then the operator bore his weight down on the handle and levered the whole tooth over and out, rolling it from its socket the way you'd work a fence post loose from the ground. The flaw in it is plain the instant you picture the thing. The brace that gave the pelican its leverage rested on the healthy teeth beside the bad one, so when the handle came down, those teeth felt it too. One leading surgeon of the age set down, with disgust, the case of an assistant who was sent to pull a single rotten tooth and wrenched out 3 sound ones along with it. A cracked jaw, a torn gum, a tooth snapped off and left buried in the bone to fester later on. These were not freak mishaps. They were the everyday hazards of the only method there was. And there was nothing to take the pain away, nothing at all. The first true anesthetic lay 4.5 centuries in the future. You went into it wide awake and fully feeling, and you were held. In the usual way of it, you sat on the ground, or a low stool, and the man stood over you and gripped your head fast between his knees, pinning it to his own body, because a head that flinches at the wrong instant is a head that gets a broken jaw. Someone might hold your wrists. You bit down. You felt the cold iron of the claw slide in beside the tooth and seat itself. And then came the long, grinding sideways force of it, with nothing to do inside that stretch but wait for it to end and fight the urge to pull away. Speed was the only mercy going, and a good draw was quick, but quick is a word measured here, in seconds that did not pass like seconds. Knowing that, you can finally understand why people put this off for so long. Why they chewed the clove and wore the prayer and lay through night after night rather than climb onto that stool. It wasn't weakness, and it wasn't ignorance. It was arithmetic. The pull itself could kill you. You might bleed and not stop, or the raw socket could turn septic and carry you off a week later, just when you'd thought the worst was over. The safest tooth to draw, then, was one already loose in the gum, ready to give with almost no force at all. Which is why the surgical manuals offered advice that sounds at first deranged. Before you pull a firm tooth, they said, spend days working at it to loosen it first. Make the tooth wobble. Turn the operation you dreaded into the smaller one you might survive. And if you imagine that money or rank could buy a way around any of this, it could not. Consider the most powerful man in Europe. In the 1680s, Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, had the upper teeth along one side of his mouth drawn by the finest surgeons his court could summon, and it went catastrophically wrong. They tore away a piece of the roof of his mouth along with the teeth, opening a hole clean through into the space behind his nose, so that for the rest of his life, when the King of France took a drink, some of it ran back out through his nostril. Their remedy was to burn the wound shut with a red-hot iron 14 times in one sitting, and more again in the weeks that followed. This was the best care on the earth, bought with the deepest purse on the earth, and it left the king with a scar you could have poured wine through. For most people, it ended less spectacularly, and now and then with a smaller, sadder joke. A Welsh gentleman named Robert Bulkley once noted in his diary that he had paid a passing tooth drawer a penny to see to his aching tooth. 2 days later, he wrote, he was a penny poorer and still had the toothache. Even the cure of last resort came with no promise it would take. But when it did take, when the tooth finally gave and tore free, there was a moment, spitting red into the dirt with your jaw ringing and the world tilting slowly back level, when the thing that had owned your every waking hour was simply gone, out of you. A small, bloody, hard-won piece. The tooth lay in the mud where the drawer had flicked it, and you were, at last, on the other side of it. And it is there, on the other side of the pain, with the tooth in the mud and the ordeal finally spent, that we can step back from the single body in the chair and put to this whole long story the quieter questions it has been circling all along. Nearly 200 years after that cottage, in a warm and well-lit palace, the most powerful woman in the world could not sleep either. Elizabeth I of England had a toothache. It had gone on for days. It had defeated everything her physicians could bring against it, and it had reduced the Queen of England, mistress of a rising empire and feared across half of Europe, to a sleepless, frightened woman holding the side of her face in the dark. Her doctors pressed her to have the tooth drawn. She refused. She was, quite simply, afraid of the pain, and being a queen made not the slightest difference to that fear. What broke the deadlock is one of the more tender things in this whole story. An elderly bishop of her court, seeing her suffering and her terror, offered to go first. He was an old man with few enough teeth left to spare, and he had one of them, a sound one, pulled out there in front of her so that she could see with her own eyes that the thing could be born. And it worked. Steadied by a frightened old man's small act of courage, the Queen let them take her tooth. That is what a toothache did, and always did, to every kind of person it reached. It did not care about your rank or your riches. We have watched it bring low a peasant in a freezing cottage, and the Sun King in his palace, and now the Queen of England in hers, and it delivered all three to the very same place, awake in the small hours, holding the jaw, afraid, and ready to try almost anything for an hour's relief. Strip away the crown and the coin, and a person with an abscess is only ever a person with an abscess. And beneath the famous names lay the millions who left no diaries, the labourer who could not afford to stop and swung the scythe anyway with his face on fire, the mother from earlier, sitting up a third night running with a feverish child, the old woman who had lost, one by one, almost every tooth she owned and had quietly learned to eat around the gaps. Not one of them simply lay down and gave in. They chewed the clove and wore the prayer and loosened the tooth and climbed onto the stool and endured. Because the one thing human beings seem unable to do in the face of pain is nothing at all. For some of them, it did not end in relief. Sometimes the tooth won. An infection that began at a single rotten root could spread down into the soft floor of the mouth and the throat, and swell, and keep swelling, until it closed the airway from the inside, so that a person could die across a day or two of a tooth by slow suffocation. Before there were antibiotics to stop it, that particular infection killed more than half the people it reached. It is a rare and easily treated thing now. It was neither rare nor treatable then. You can measure how close that danger sat to ordinary life in the old lists of the dead that London kept. For a stretch of years, those records placed teeth among the leading causes of death in the whole city, ahead of things we would think far graver. But look closer at who was actually dying, and the picture turns quietly devastating. They were mostly not grown men and women with rotten molars. They were babies, infants in their first year or two, dying in great numbers in the very months their first teeth were pushing through. The teeth were not the cause. They were only the thing everyone could see. Something else was carrying these children off. Fevers, infections of the gut, the ordinary killers of being very small in an unclean world. And a grieving family, watching a feverish, wailing child with a swollen gum and a new white tooth coming up through it, reached for the explanation right in front of them and wrote down the word teeth. That may be the truest measure of the distance between their world and ours. Not that they suffered more, though they did. It is that so often they could not see what was actually happening to them, and had to make their peace with the pain and with the loss of the people they loved without ever really being told why. It is tempting, sitting here in the warmth and the light, to feel one of two easy things about them: to pity them, poor souls born too soon, made to bear what we would never stand, or, stranger and rarer, to envy them a little, their closeness, their patience, their lives unclouded by our particular noise. Both feelings are ways of keeping them at arm's length. Both are quietly untrue, because they were not another kind of creature. The tooth in that 600-year-old jaw is the same tooth you are carrying now, with the same nerve threaded through its root, wired to the same brain, sounding the same alarm. The fear that kept a queen out of the chair is the fear you would feel in it. They were not simpler than us, and they were not braver than us by nature. They were us, handed a colder, harder, more painful world, and meeting it, most days, with an ordinary courage we would like to believe we'd find in their place, and are fortunate almost never to be asked for. That is the thing to carry out of all this. We did not earn the painless mouths we walk around in. We did nothing wiser or worthier than the woman in the cottage who lay awake with her hand pressed to her jaw. We were only born later, on the far side of a line drawn barely a century and a half ago, a line that divides a world where pain like that was simply the weather of a life from a world where, for most of us, it has shrunk to something small and passing. She would not have pitied herself. She would only have been quietly astonished at us, at what we can make vanish and how little we notice that we can. So here is where we leave them and come back to ourselves. Somewhere in your home tonight, there is a small bottle or a strip of foil with a few tablets pressed into it. You know the one. If a tooth flared up at 2 in the morning, that deep, familiar pulse spreading along the jaw, you would reach for it half asleep, swallow 2 with a mouthful of water, and sink back down within the hour, the pain already loosening its hold. You would not be afraid. By morning, you would barely remember. In a day or two, you would sit in a bright, clean room while someone mended the tooth for good and grumble gently about the cost of it. None of that is nothing. It is one of the quietest miracles we own, and we sleep on top of it every night without a thought. The woman in the cold cottage would have given almost anything for the little bottle in your cabinet. She never had it. She had the dark and the worm she believed in, and a scrap of parchment tied to her face, and her own plain courage, and the morning that came whether the pain had passed or not. She got up. She went to work, and behind her, and behind you, runs a line of people longer than history can hold, every one of them awake at some point in the night with a tooth, and nothing to take for it, and no choice but to bear it until it passed, or bear it until it didn't. You will almost certainly never have to. That is the whole distance between their world and yours, held in one small bottle on one high shelf. Take it when you need it, and once in a great while, notice that you can.